Right, hello everyone, my name is Mike and we are back again with another reaction video, this time to Oversimplified's First World War video. I really enjoyed doing the Second World War reaction videos to Oversimplified. I thought they was really entertaining, really engaging. I'm looking forward to more of the same. This one's only 6 minutes long, but yeah, without further ado, let's get into it.
The world of 1914, a time of modern technology, culture, and fashion. Truly the height of civilization. Let's have a war. Everyone knew a big war was coming. France wanted some stuff back that Germany had taken from it. Germany wanted to take more of everyone's stuff, and they were building a big sexy navy that was making the British uncomfortable. These two empires thought they were really cool, but lots of different people who lived there didn't think it was so cool. And some of them had even been declaring independence with help from Russia. Everyone was talking about each other behind each other's backs, throwing the fact that military technology had come a long way since the last major war, and suddenly everyone was pretty eager to beat each other up. In this area of Austria-Hungary lived some Serbs and Bosnians who hated living in Austria-Hungary. So the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand goes there for a nice drive in an open-top car, with his car's route published in advance. And that went just about as well as you'd expect. Some assassins were waiting for him along the way and threw bombs at his car, but they missed and blew up some officers behind him instead. So the Archduke goes into hiding, leaves Sarajevo, and the whole war never happens. Except no, the Archduke doesn't leave, but instead goes back out in the open-top car to visit the injured officers in hospital. The driver takes a wrong turn and by sheer coincidence gets stuck beside one of the failed assassins, who shoots him. Austria-Hungary is understandably pissed about all.
Okay, so quickly, just because this is skimmed over a lot. I mean, yeah, it's to be expected. It's called Oversimplified. But yeah, particularly as well, Bosnia. Bosnia was annexed, and it was called the Bosnian Crisis in 1908 to 1904. And Austria, by annexing Bosnia, was kind of going back on an agreement that they agreed in 1878, where nations would be kind of governed by Austria-Hungary, but wouldn't be directly annexed. They wouldn't be controlled fully. They would still have some degree of sovereignty or autonomy. And so the annexation of Bosnia was deeply controversial, and particularly as well, it really infuriated Russia. And it was only really when Germany stood up alongside Austria that Russia was forced to kind of back down. And that kind of sowed more seeds for what would go on to happen. And at the beginning of the video, they were speaking about Germany wanting to take over everywhere, and also France wanting to take back Alsace-Lorraine. And now that happened in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. And so basically France, having seen Prussia virtually batter the Austrians in a war, was eager to kind of become the dominant force on the continent once again. And so their idea was to essentially fight the Prussians. However, this was masterminded a little bit by Bismarck. And ultimately, why it ended, not only did France lose the war, lose Alsace-Lorraine, but it also led to the unification of Germany. And so, ironically, France, in an attempt to undermine and weaken Germany, actually just made them, well, Germany made them stronger. And the concept of Germany wanting to take over everywhere is this move from Realpolitik to Weltpolitik. So the concept beforehand was Realpolitik was practical politics. This is what Bismarck favoured heavily, which was making political decisions and stuff centred on nation building, on very German, European-centric, low risk kind of idea. But when Bismarck was dismissed, Weltpolitik came into, and that was kind of coined the term by von Bülow, who was all about Germany trying to, what he stated was, have their place in the sun. So he saw the colonial empires of Britain, of France, and these other places. And basically Germany wanted a piece of that. They wanted to get involved in the scramble of Africa. They wanted to get their own colonies. They wanted to become this global kind of colonial power as well. And that, I said, kind of went directly against Realpolitik, because by becoming a colonial power and seizing colonies, you're also then interfering with other spheres of influence beyond Europe, particularly the British and the French. So that was already one kind of sheer move. It moved away from practical pragmatism, low risk, to Weltpolitik after Bismarck was dismissed became very more high risk, more ambitious, and that again is an argument that people point to in the build up of the First World War, was that it was always moving towards escalating tensions. However, the other thing they mentioned as well was Germany building up a naval fleet, and that was Flottenpolitik, and that was one of the big things that actually drew resentment between the British and the Germans. Was before Flottenpolitik, which is what the 5 naval laws that the German state was passing to build up its navy. There wasn't much ill feeling between British and the Germans. However, once the Flottenpolitik became into effect, particularly as well in the early 1900s, 1906 region, Britain started to get really worried about Germany, because the build-up of their navy, not only did they see as a threat to, well, the invasion of the English Channel, which Britain has always tried to operate a system of navy where the British Navy would be twice as big as the 2 other European powers combined. So not only did it have a risk that Germany might be trying to dominate European navy, but also by building up its fleet and in combination with Weltpolitik, Britain also saw that as a threat to its colonial interests, and that Germany was seeking to not only become a dominant naval power in Europe, but also if it could become a global naval power and perhaps even rival the Royal Navy, which was its design, then Germany could really threaten Britain's overseas interests. And so I think that covers the things that it's oversimplified in the first few minutes, but let's see where this goes. So Franz Ferdinand, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, has been assassinated by terrorists, essentially, in Bosnia, in Sarajevo. However, Austria blames Serbia for it, but we'll get into that.
This, and they think the Serbian government had something to do with it, which they might have. So they go to their ally Germany and say, hey Germany, we're going to declare war on Serbia, and Germany is all for that. So Austria-Hungary send a big list of impossible demands to Serbia, and when Serbia refuses, they declare war. Okay, so the assassins, the terrorists, or whatever you want to call them, were referred to the Black Hand. They were called the Black Hand, and the reason why Austria blamed Serbia is because there was some evidence to suggest that the Serbian military or the Serbian government had either provided them with arms and munitions or provided them with some sort of other guidance, whether that is necessarily straight to assassinating Franz Ferdinand or whether that was just to cause some sort of minor insurgency is debatable. But however, Austria strongly blamed Serbia. And when it asked Germany, basically, did it have their back, that is referred to as the blank check. Where when Austria went to Germany and said that they were going to basically threaten Serbia, Germany responded with the blank check, which was perceived as do whatever you want. Whatever you do, Germany will have your back, basically. And there's some arguments to say what this actually meant. There are some in the school of thought that Germany just meant, yeah, you know, I'll have your back, and it'll basically make Russia, who was Serbia's ally, back down, just as it had done in the Bosnian crisis, as I previously said. It was when Germany stood alongside Austria that Russia backed down in 1908, 1909, and so there are some that believed that Germany was thinking if it does that again, then Russia would just simply back down, and Austria would be able to simply annex Serbia freely as it wants. However, there is another school of thought that Germany was actually deliberately saying blank check, yeah, war, because it was almost seeking a war. It wanted to fight a war. And particularly when you look at the list of demands that Austria actually sent to Serbia, there is significant evidence to suggest that Austria, at the very least, was seeking outright conflict with Serbia. Whether they thought that that would develop into the global conflict that it did is debatable, but there was 10 listed demands on that ultimatum. And the Serbian government actually did accept some of them. There was some others, though, that they point blankly had to refuse, otherwise they would undermine and lose practically all their sovereignty as a sovereign nation.
one of which was involving basically Austrian policing within Serbia. Allowing Austrian officials to kind of conduct their affairs within Serbia, which would be not only a affront to the new nation of Serbia as it was here, but also, remember, a lot of these countries in the Balkans were under Ottoman occupation not too long ago. And so a lot of the Balkan nations are very, very eager and very reluctant to surrender any of that autonomy, any of their independence, because they've only just recently got that. And so by Austria issuing those demands, which essentially, again, undermine that, it seems Austria was fairly willing to go to war, and Germany, by giving them the blank check, was almost, well, a large school of thought from historians is essentially when Germany gives Austria the blank check, that is the thumbs up for war, and that is the kind of one massive leap towards what will develop.
Austria-Hungary and Germany are friends, and Serbia is protected by Russia, who's friends with France, so they'll declare war on each other. Montenegro joins in too. France and Britain also have a kind of alliance, so when France says, "Hey Britain, you got my back?" Britain is like, maybe?
Yeah, so you had the Triple Entente, and the Triple Entente was kind of made a thing in 1907, I think. And yeah, so previously what I said under realpolitik, one of Bismarck's key things for Germany was to avoid a two-front war wherever possible, and that was to keep France isolated. And they've done that through pursuing good relations with Russia, because if they could keep Russia kind of sweet, then that meant their only real threat in Europe was France. However, there was a treaty signed in secret, and I can't remember the name of it, but essentially that wasn't kept, and frequent kind of hostilities, not open hostilities, but disagreements, arguments, and essentially foreign arguments over Balkans meant that Austria kind of drove a wedge between Germany and Russia. And this, as a result, kind of led to France and Russia finding themselves allies by kind of circumstance. However, while Britain was kind of part of the Triple Entente, it was kind of there but aloof. Britain, for a large part, wanted to kind of stay out of European affairs. Their sphere of influence and their kind of concentration was outside of Europe, their colonies, their empire. And so when this happened, while Britain was in the Triple Entente, they weren't steadfast allies, really. And even when the war actually broke out, it wasn't really out of any loyalty. Well, I'm of the opinion that it wasn't of any loyalty. It was more following Britain's habit, or Britain's tradition of ensuring that no one power becomes dominant on the continent. Because once one power becomes dominant on the continent, that then leads to threatening British interests, not only Britain itself, but British overseas interests. And particularly with France in the First World War, well, I'm skipping ahead, we'll see when we get to it.
And then they decide to stay out of it, which is great for Germany, because Germany has a plan. They know that Russia is so big and clumsy that it will take them a while to get ready for war. So with this guy in charge, Germany will send all its troops into France at lightning speed while Russia's getting ready, defeat France, then move all the troops to Russia and defeat Russia, and then we all speak German and eat Pfeffer Podcast every day. Just one problem. France has loads of forts and defenses along its German border, and Germany can't waste any time fighting them, so Germany decides to go around them through Belgium.
So previously what I said about Bismarck's policy was to stop a two-front war wherever possible. And however, despite him being dismissed for a couple of decades now at this point, even though Weltpolitik was in full swing and there was more ambition, as you can tell by the Schlieffen Plan, there was still that kind of desire to avoid a two-front war. And that led to the Schlieffen Plan, which was essentially punch through Belgium to bypass the French defences and then sweep down and try and capitulate France from the north before Russia had time to mobilise. Because again, Russia by far had the largest reserves that they could call up. However, due to the grand size of Russia and the general logistics of doing that, Germany thought that their hope was to capitulate France and then turn on Russia before they've had a chance to properly mobilise and can form a proper defence or a proper offensive against the German and the Austro-Hungarians. However, as it happens, Russia mobilised far quicker than the Germans could actually imagine or predict. And not only this, but this was kind of one major point in the invasion of Belgium, because Belgium was a neutral country. It declared its neutrality when war broke out, and it was protected by the Treaty of London, which meant that Britain basically promised to protect Belgium. And as a result of this, it was kind of the last straw for Britain. Previously, what I said about Britain not necessarily joining the war out of loyalty, there is an argument to be made that Belgium was the loyal part of the First World War, but again, there's an argument to be made either way. That yes, by no doubt, German invasion of Belgium strongly swung public opinion against the Germans, and particularly in Britain, it swung public opinion strongly for war, because at home, for the Allies, well, not only for Britain but for the Allies as a whole, Belgium was looked at as the small, plucky Belgium who declared their neutrality or are innocent and have just been invaded, and so it turned public opinion against them. And obviously, by Belgium enacting the Treaty of London, Britain was kind of bound to step in and help them. Obviously, treaties can be broken, but previously what I said as well, Britain necessarily wanted to stay out of European affairs, but given that this war was happening, the last thing that they wanted was actually a German victory, because had the Schlieffen Plan succeeded and Germany swept through Belgium and then swept through northern France, depending on how that peace treaty deal looks like, there is a realistic chance that Germany could secure some of the Low Countries or some of northern coast of France, and that would mean that Germany would have then a direct link to the English Channel, and with their building up of their naval reserves meant that that threat of naval invasion and that threat of European naval dominance could become a real thing. And so, particularly after the French defeat in 1870 in the Franco-Prussian War, Britain very much did not want another repeat of that. And so again, that's a large reason why historians point to not only the invasion of Belgium, but just simply not out of any real love or loyalty to France, but out of sheer practicality, that Britain was in no position to let France fall, because it would not serve their interests at all, whether that is in the European theatre or overseas, because it would just make Germany the dominant power on the continent, and Britain throughout its history does not like one power dominating the European continent.
Belgium is neutral, but Germany wants to march 750,000 troops through it to get around France's defenses. They're hoping Belgium will just kind of sit down and shut up, but they don't. They fight back, and they're pretty good too, so they slow the Germans down. What's worse is that Britain shows up, and they're pretty pissed that Germany's invading neutral countries. So now Britain declares war on Germany. So Germany push on through Belgium and commit some atrocities along the way. They also wear spikes and sometimes skulls on the uniform. So if you're trying to not look like the bad guys, good job. The Allies have a propaganda extravaganza, and this starts having an influence around the world, notably in America. The US President Woodrow Wilson sees himself as a bit of a Jesus figure, and spends most of the war trying to get everyone to just hug it out. But there's also a large population of ethnic Germans living in the United States, and when the war first broke out, they were like, yay Germany! But now that they're committing atrocities in Belgium, they're less enthusiastic. Let's play Spot the French Soldier. Did you see him? Easy, right? He's wearing a bright blue uniform with red trousers. And do you know who else spotted him easily too? The Germans. So when the French were slowly marching in columns through the countryside, the Germans easily tore them to shreds with their giant guns. All the nations involved in this war went in with an old school war mentality.
Yeah, so the First World War is kind of where a lot of people point to the whole concept of dying for your country and war is great kind of ends. Because beforehand, while casualties could be high, not necessarily in Europe, but when you look at the American Civil War with the technology such as breech-loading rifles and breech-loading artillery pieces, and the rise of artillery generally as a whole, and the decline of more traditional methods such as bayonet charges and cavalry charges and stuff like that. While they were devastating and bloody in some instances, such as Waterloo and things like that, they weren't so costly as there was in the First World War. You know, bayonet charges, for example, very rarely were kind of bayonet charges out and out slaughters, because the whole concept of a bayonet charge is that one side will break or rout before the bayonet charge even reaches them, and therefore, you know, by virtue you have less casualties, because it's more about making the opponents rout and kind of flee the field rather than utterly destroy them. And at this point, really, in the First World War, we have this weird kind of limbo where some wars are still being fought with almost a 19th, 18th century mindset, but with 20th century technology. So again, this is, I mean, the American Civil War and some other conflicts did see some degree of automatic weapons being used, you know, the Gatlins and stuff like that, but never on the scale that it was. Machine guns, as in out and out machine guns, artillery that is capable of firing miles away, and not only firing miles away, but firing high explosive. It was a completely different thing that nobody really was capable of or really understanding. And particularly the bottom, dying for your country is awesome. That was the kind of the old image, and you know, one of the most famous war poets of the First World War being Wilfred Owen. He even had the poem called Dulce et decorum est po patra morti, which is basically is beautiful or honourable to die for your country. And that's strongly anti-war, obviously, but the whole concept of war as an adventure was a thing. You know, sign up, see the world. You know, to a degree, almost is a kind of advert selling point now, and it still, I think, continues to be. However, nobody was prepared for what the First World War actually turned out to be. And I think, again, these four things really shown here are a testament to that. Is a lot of people did join up, particularly in Britain, join up in the war because they thought it would be short. They thought it would be over by Christmas. A lot of the individual soldiers, not talking about generals or staff members or anything like that, but they thought they'd see things. And obviously they got bogged down for over 4 years. Many never came home. Bayonet charges are cool, whereas again, trench warfare, machine guns, bolt action rifles, which with a fire rate that is unimaginable, again puts pay to that, the same as cavalry charges. Although some did happen. Winston Churchill actually led one of the last cavalry charges, so that's a fun tip for you. But yeah, and particularly I hope they go back to the uniforms, because I'll just skip back to the uniforms. So the French uniforms as well, we're in this bright blue and red. Again, it's linking back to what I previously said. You're fighting a war with 18th and 19th century kind of mindsets. Britain itself learnt this the hard way in the Boer War, where kind of the bright red tunics and stuff like that knew that they stand out, and Britain kind of learned that the hard way when they was fighting the Boers in South Africa, because the Boers would come on them while they're wearing while they're in columns, while they're wearing their bright red tunics, and eventually that led to the British adopting khaki, and that's why the red tunics, the scarlet tunics, are kind of still reserved for ceremonial purposes and stuff like that. But khaki, you know, camouflage, is simply just a more practical choice to blend in with your environment, to make you harder to spot, and ultimately to make you harder to kill. And as seen here, the French wearing bright blue and red, they stick out like a sore thumb. And again, it took, while other nations somewhat changed quickly, when finding out this was the loss, this was the situation, the French particularly persisted with bright blue, red, long into the war, and again cloth hats as well, for some of them. Again, it offers no real protection, but it just shows again how little prepared some nations were for what the First World War would actually turn into.
and all of them had to update their
Yeah.
uniforms and tactics.
No
a lot
boots, no
during the Great
helmets,
War,
bright red trousers.
because this war was going to be like nothing anyone had ever seen before. Russia's ready for war, and way earlier than expected.
Yep.
Hey, Austria-Hungary, can you get on top of that? Oh yeah, sure, we've got this. Nope. So Germany has to send some troops back to the east to defend against the Russians. The chief of staff of the Austro-Hungarian army is this guy, and although he is handsome, he turns out not to be the best military strategist. Austria-Hungary constantly ignores Germany's advice, and then comes running back to Germany whenever they get in trouble. Austria-Hungary even gets its ass kicked by tiny Serbia, who repels all their invasion attempts at the start of the war. It's better news for Germany in the north, though, where they almost completely wipe out the Russian Second Army. Back on the western front, the Germans continue advancing and are in sight of Paris. At this point, anyone would be forgiven for thinking the Germans were going to get that quick victory after all. But then things start to go wrong. The French commander-in-chief knew something had to be done, and he ordered his armies to stop retreating. In the resulting battle, a gap opened up in the German lines. If a gap opens up, the enemy can use it to flank you from the side and behind, so the German armies have to retreat. The Allies launch a counterattack, so the Germans dig into defensive positions. The Allies do the same. Then both sides move north, trying to outflank each other along the way.
Yeah, race for the coast.
They're in a stalemate, with trench systems running the whole way from the coast to Switzerland, the beginning of trench warfare on the Western Front. Here's how trench warfare works. Two opposing lines of trenches with no man's land in between. One side would pummel the other with hundreds of thousands of artillery shells, sometimes for days at a time. This had a huge psychological effect on the soldiers, leaving many shell-shocked.
Yeah, shell shock is kind of where we get the word from, shell shock, and when in reality what we know is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, there's this common misconception that it originated in the First World War, where PTSD has existed long before the First World War. Particularly as well, there are memoirs and diary entries from Waterloo, soldiers who fought at Waterloo, both, particularly more so the British, because they were on the receiving end of a long and extreme French artillery bombardment. And for a lot of those as well, in their memoirs and their diaries, both at the time and long after, many British soldiers who were at Waterloo actually suffered what would now be considered PTSD from the artillery bombardment that they faced by the French. And remember, that is by cannons, that is by traditional cannons, that is by 18, 16, 20, 24 pounder guns. This is not what they faced, and obviously I'm not undermining what they went through, but for soldiers back then to suffer PTSD, you can only imagine what the sight, what the sound of World War I artillery would have done. Because remember as well, a lot of the soldiers who are fighting here as well, they're unaccustomed to this type of combat. You know, they're not used to massive field guns firing from miles away and with a firepower potential to literally delete a person from existence. And again, as you can tell, by the gentleman sitting down on the left with his eyes, that is shell shock. You know, you're almost almost insane. It's almost insanity. He has shell shock and PTSD, and just war has the capability to break somebody's mind. And again, the unfortunate thing is a lot of people suffering shell shock, a lot of people suffering PTSD. I don't know so much for German or French, but particularly in the British Army, a lot of soldiers were unfortunately executed for cowardice or desertion, because what they was actually suffering was PTSD and shell shock. But at the time, that was regarded as cowardice or deserting your post. All others were put into mental asylums because they were deemed that their mind had broken, rather than necessarily just needing some R&R or something like that. But yeah.
Then, the attacking troops would leave their trenches and rush across no man's land, a muddy wet mass of shell craters and barbed wire. The defending trench would unleash machine gun fire on the attackers, inflicting thousands of casualties. The attackers would send wave after wave until either they gave up or the opposing trench was finally overrun. There would be months of fighting and the deaths of thousands in order to gain a few meters or kilometers of land. Living in the trenches was hard work too. Corpses, mud that could swallow you whole, pools of poisonous water, rats, disease, the smell. It's insane that millions of soldiers put up with these conditions, and commanders ordered them to do so for years.
Okay, that's the end of part 1. So that was really good. That was really informative. I enjoyed that as well. And obviously, I apologise if I got a little bit rambly. A 6-minute video, I said I really appreciate what these guys do here as well. I really like it. However, a 6-minute video to kind of go over the kind of origins or beginnings of the First World War, that is certainly putting the name Oversimplified to the test there. So I hope I've been able to expand on what the video overglossed or oversimplified by its name. Hopefully you've learned something new if you didn't already, and hopefully you enjoyed this. And so I'll get on to part 2, and I'll catch you in the next one.